Hello, everyone. Welcome to the ICNC webinar series. My name is Maciej Bartkowski. I am a senior advisor at the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict. I have a great pleasure of hosting today Dr. Jonathan Pinckney and moderating his webinar talk that is titled, How Can Civil Resistance Win Well? Breakthroughs and Breakdowns on the Road to Democracy. Jonathan's presentation will be in fact based on the ICNC special report that he wrote with the title How to Win Well, Civil Resistance Breakthroughs and the Path to Democracy. As the series editor of this publication, I cannot shower enough praises on Jonathan's writing. It's not only an excellent contribution to civil resistance field, but it's also easily accessible to practitioners and activists. And his study includes a number of actionable recommendations for those who are interested in the most effective ways of supporting country on its road to democracy. Jonathan's special report can be downloaded for free from the ICNC website, so please use this opportunity to access it and read in your free time. I don't know if Jonathan remembers, but he was introduced to me by his that time academic mentor, Erica Chenoweth, when he was just starting his PhD program at University of Denver. And Erica told me about a promising young scholar who is deeply interested in the subject of civil resistance. And she brought to my attention his MA dissertation that covers civil resistance initiated breakthroughs and probability for democratization. From the very beginning, I was very interested in that writing, and soon afterwards, I was on the call with Jonathan discussing his thesis and the key findings and his ongoing work. And I thought what Jonathan was working on could be very useful for activists in their thinking about the day after their victory, as well as to the external allies. ICNC awarded Jonathan with a number of writing and research fellowships, and we soon began collaborating on projects that culminated in the publication of two major monographs that were written by Jonathan and that are available on the ICNC website. One of those monographs is looking into how movements can sustain nonviolent discipline, and another one on the impact of civil resistance on building democracy after the struggle. So 2 monographs later, I got back to Jonathan and asked him to consider writing another piece as part of the ICNC special report series that would expand on his democratizing breakthroughs and civil resistance. Fortunately for all of us, Jonathan agreed, and we have now an insightful report on why different types of civil resistance-led breakthroughs are important to consider when thinking about the probability of successful democratization. This report, I think, is especially useful for democracy supporters, practitioners, and activists who are looking to find answers on how best to prepare for a major political breakthrough in the authoritarian country and increase their chances for pushing for democratization after the fall of the authoritarian regime. So now I would like to briefly introduce Jonathan. Jonathan Pinckney is a senior researcher for the Program on Nonviolent Action at the United States Institute of Peace, where he conducts applied research on nonviolent action, peace building, and democratization. He is the author of From Dissent to Democracy, The Promise and Peril of Civil Resistance Transitions, published by Oxford University Press last year. He's also the author of numerous academic articles and other publications, including the earlier mentioned 2 ICNC monographs, and right now the ICNC special report on democratizing breakthroughs. He received his PhD in 2018 from the University of Denver. So after Jonathan's talk, I will ask our attendees to join Q&A, and I will call on people who raise their hands to ask their questions. I would also like to remind our audience that we are live tweeting from the ICNC Twitter account at Civil Resistance, and people can share their reactions on Twitter using hashtag ICNC webinars. So now, without further ado, I would like to ask Jonathan to take over from me and go ahead with presentation. So Jonathan, the virtual floor is yours.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Maciej. And thank you so much, everyone, for being here today. It's a real pleasure to get to share some work with you that, as Maciej mentioned, in some form or another, I've been working on for the last 7 years. These questions of democratization, and in particular, the impact of breakthrough mechanisms on the future of democracy. Maciej mentioned a little bit about the origin story of this particular special report, and I will say sort of one part of that origin story in particular that always stands out to me is in 2018, right after I had given a talk at the University of Maryland that ICNC had set up related to one of my earlier monographs. Maciej and I were sort of standing outside waiting for an Uber to come on a sort of a beautiful fall day. And Maciej, brought up the subject of my MA thesis and this question of the impact of breakthroughs, and said, have you ever thought about sort of doing something more with that? I thought that was really, really interesting work. And initially, I will say I was somewhat reluctant because, while I stood by the work, it was something that I hadn't focused on in a little bit of time. I was thinking about new projects, and so, initially I was like, well, I'm not quite sure about this. Maybe we'll see. But Maciej persisted, and I'm very glad that he did, because it gave me the opportunity to really dive into this once again, and to have this research out in a form that is, I think, hopefully more accessible and available for both activists, practitioners, and others. So Maciej, thanks as well for your sort of support of my work and for pushing me to actually get this into a form that people will be able to read and digest more easily. So a little bit about kind of the underlying motivation for this research, and I think these two images really capture it quite well. These are both images from Egypt. On the left-hand side, you see one of the protests during the 2011 so-called Arab Spring uprising. Now, of course, this was a moment that I think was very important for a lot of people who are interested in nonviolent resistance, whether they are activists, scholars, external democracy support practitioners, or others, because it really stood as this example of hope, that even in an environment that had been previously very resistant to political change, that through nonviolent action, real change seemed to be possible. For me personally, I'll say as well, the 2011 revolution in Egypt was very personally resonant, because I had lived in Egypt a couple of years prior and had a number of friends who were involved in protests during the 2011 revolution in various ways. And so the revolution, came as a shock to me personally, both as well as someone who was, beginning to think about academic research in the space of nonviolent action and nonviolent resistance. But then, of course, following this moment of hope, we had a very sort of problematic, rocky transition along many dimensions that culminated, of course, in 2013 with a military coup and the massacre of peaceful protesters at the Rabaa Adawiya Mosque that you can see depicted on the right-hand side here. And then in the end, this moment of hope in 2011 was followed by a return to an authoritarianism that in many ways was even worse and more repressive than the regime that had preceded the revolution. And so this was a question that really has been motivating me and motivating my research for a long time now. Why do we see cases like this? Why does nonviolent action sometimes lead to democracy, but sometimes doesn't? Now, of course, I'm not the first person to ask this question. Many others have looked at this before. So what do we know already about the relationship between nonviolent resistance and democracy? Well, from the work of many prior scholars, including Erica Chenoweth and Maria Steffen, Peter Ackerman, Christian Gleditsch, and others, we know that nonviolent action is indeed a very powerful democratizing force. That political transitions that happen through nonviolent resistance are much more likely to end in democracy than any other kind of political transition. And if I can do a shameless plug for some of my own prior research, in my book that Maciej mentioned previously, From Dissent to Democracy, I show that transitional politics really matters for these particular cases. That to understand this question of when nonviolent resistance is going to lead to democracy and when not, we have to dig into what happens the day after the civil resistance movement succeeds. What happens in the weeks, months, and years following as new transitional institutions are set up, as constitutions are written, as elections happen, and eventually as a new political regime takes shape. And so in particular, in my book, I show that there are two key factors that really matter in shaping the democratic outcome of those transitions. Whether civic engagement and political mobilization continues through the transitional period, and whether that mobilization is shifted away from sort of maximalist or revolutionary goals into supporting and building up new institutions. So these are two things that really matter for understanding when nonviolent resistance is going to lead to democracy. But of course, that begs a question, which is, where do these transitional politics come from? This doesn't just come out of nothing. Why are some political transitions after nonviolent resistance, dominated by old regime elites that want to have a return to authoritarianism, by fragmented oppositions that are pursuing revolutionary goals rather than building new political institutions? Why do some transitions look so different from others? Well, what I argue in this special report and in sort of the prior research that I've done in this space is that the breakthrough mechanism is one key factor that really shapes these transitional political arrangements and thus has a longer term impact on democracy. So what do I mean by a breakthrough? Because this is sort of the key factor here. Well, a breakthrough, as I'm using the term, is this key moment when a maximalist campaign achieves its goals. You can think of it as the sort of the hinge point between when a movement is primarily struggling to achieve a change and when we know that a change is going to happen, but we don't know exactly what the shape of that change is going to be. Whether there's going to be, whether an authoritarian regime is going to come to an end, a military occupation is going to end, a new country is going to come about through secession, that sort of basic question is no longer at issue. We know that's going to happen, but we don't know what it's going to look like. And that's going to be worked out through the following transitional politics. So for an example of one particular breakthrough mechanism, you can think of the roundtable negotiations in Poland in the late 1980s. You can see in this picture here, between the Solidarity movement and the communist government of Poland, that sort of established the terms through which that political regime would come to an end and a new political arrangement would happen. And so breakthroughs are crucial because this is typically the moment at which nonviolent action campaigns are at their greatest potential and have their greatest position of influence. Once transitions start, then the unity that has characterized a nonviolent action campaign can fragment, mobilization tends to decline at least somewhat, and it's harder for these campaigns to continue to have a significant as powerful an input on the transitional arrangements as they can have at the moment of breakthrough. My key contention about breakthroughs is that these really differ in how they influence transitional politics. That one kind of breakthrough can set up a transition for failure and for a return to authoritarianism, and that other breakthroughs can really set things up for democratization and success. So what does this sort of landscape of breakthroughs actually look like, and sort of what are then those impacts on long-term democratization? Well, a little bit about the research that I did here. I looked at every successful maximalist nonviolent resistance campaign from 1945 through 2011, building off of the NAVCO data set from Erica Chenoweth and a few additional cases that I was able to find through my own independent research. And then looked at those key moments when the movement achieved success, when success was no longer in question. And then did a rough categorization of what do these different breakthrough moments look like. And what I found was that across every single one of those cases, the type of breakthrough could be categorized into 6 basic categories. And you could see those pictured on the graph here with sort of the frequency with which they occur in different successful nonviolent resistance campaigns. And I'll briefly sort of talk through each one of those here. So the most frequent mechanism through which breakthrough occurs in civil resistance campaigns are elections. Now, again, these are typically elections that are taking place in authoritarian regimes. So the elections are not themselves free and fair. They require a nonviolent resistance campaign to push for freedom and fairness and to ensure that the government, that the authoritarian government honors the results of those elections. And a good, sort of some of the best examples of breakthrough through an election are some of the color revolutions in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union in the early 2000s. Second mechanism are negotiations. And again, these are, I think, probably fairly self-explanatory, but a case in which the civil resistance campaign, their main opponent and other leaders sit down and work out an end to the conflict through some kind of formal or informal negotiation process. Third are resignations, where leaders of the opposing regime simply voluntarily step down from power in response to pressure from the civil resistance campaign. Also fairly common, you can see here on the graph, negotiations and resignations, while not as common as elections, happen in a number of cases. Next are coups d'état, in which some fragment of the authoritarian regime engages in an independent seizure of power. These are often this is often done by the military, but can be done by other parts of the regime as well. And Egypt in 2011, case I mentioned at the beginning and that I'll come back to later on, is one particularly good example of a civil resistance campaign achieving breakthrough through the mechanism of a coup d'état. And then we have two sort of quite more rare, less common breakthrough mechanisms, but that still occur in a few key cases. The first are what I call overwhelmings. And this is the case in which sort of there's no sort of formal mechanism through which the opponent sort of gives up or steps down from power, but simply the campaign reaches such a level of pervasiveness throughout society that the mechanisms of power, the pillars of support for the regime simply disintegrate, and the regime is no longer able to sustain itself. As I mentioned, this is quite rare, but one case that I think is a good example of this is the so-called Tulip Revolution in Kyrgyzstan in 2005, in which President Askar Akayev simply had to flee the country because sort of his political regime and his security forces more or less fell apart in response to the massive civil resistance campaign they were facing. And finally, and most rare, are external interventions in which an international actor intervenes forcefully, either diplomatically or militarily, in order for a movement's goals to be achieved. And I think, as I mentioned, this is the rarest out of these breakthrough mechanisms. But one key example of this would be, say, East Timor in the late 1990s, in which a UN intervention helped that movement to achieve success. So we've got these 6 mechanisms, and that really covers the ground of all of the successful civil resistance campaigns from 1945 through 2011. So with those as our breakthrough mechanisms, what might we expect, or which breakthrough mechanisms might we expect to have the most positive impact on democratization? Well, I argue in the special report that there are sort of 3 characteristics of breakthrough mechanisms that we would expect to be most influential for shaping the transition process afterwards, and ultimately the political regime that's going to come into being at the end of that transition process. And those are initiative, balance of power, and the setup of new institutions. So the initiative is simply, which political actor or group in society played the biggest role in shaping the breakthrough mechanism, and which actor does the breakthrough mechanism set up to sort of start the game of transitional politics. Which actor is best positioned to take advantage of the unique and sort of open and flexible situation of a political transition? Is that initiative with old regime insiders who may have sort of less democratic preferences, or is it with civil resistance campaign leaders, civil society leaders, or others who may have more democratic preferences? Next, and sort of similar but slightly different, is the question of balance of power. How does the breakthrough mechanism set up the control of the political and social institutions that are going to shape the future transition process? Are the people at the head of those institutions, again, those with sort of more democratic preferences, or those whose preferences we might expect to be more aligned towards a return to some kind of authoritarianism? And finally, does the breakthrough mechanism normalize political competition and set things up for the establishment of new institutions that are going to be helpful in building a new political regime? Because if it doesn't, if there isn't that sort of impetus towards normalizing political competition, then we're likely to see a very sort of combative political transition that over the long term is likely to undermine people's faith in the possibility of democracy and facilitate a return to authoritarianism. So I argue in the special report that out of these 6 breakthrough mechanisms that we see across successful civil resistance campaigns, that I expect negotiations and elections out of those 6 to have the most positive impact, that they give sort of initiative and balance of power to actors who are much more likely to have democratic preferences and help set up new normalized political institutions. So that's kind of the key argument, the key hypothesis that I wanted to test with this data on breakthrough mechanisms in civil resistance campaigns that I collected. Now, won't go into all of the details of how I go about testing this, but of course, happy to answer questions about it in the Q&A. But in short, I do indeed find that negotiations and elections have a very powerful impact on leading to higher levels of democracy. That if your civil resistance campaign succeeds through negotiations and elections, you tend to have the political regimes that follow tend to be much more democratic than those that succeed through other mechanisms. And there's sort of some of the output of one of my statistical models you can see there. And again, happy to go into sort of more detail on this in Q&A as people are interested. 2 sort of brief examples to illustrate sort of the different impacts of contrasting breakthrough mechanisms. I've mentioned Egypt a couple of times, and you can see here again a picture of the breakthrough mechanism in process. The announcement by Egyptian Vice President Omar Suleiman that Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak was stepping down from power and that the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces would be assuming power in his stead and leading the transition. Now, I argue that rather than a sort of a resignation, this is in fact a coup d'état, because by sort of what we best know from kind of the literature on this case is that Mubarak resigned not sort of under his own volition, but under sort of very significant pressure from military leaders who were concerned about the destabilization associated with the 2011 revolution. So this is a coup d'état. The coup d'état privileges the position of the Egyptian military, and in particular, the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces. They're able to have an outsized impact on setting up the political institutions that then characterize the future transition, and that as well, this sort of non-consensus-based, combative mechanism of a coup d'état doesn't establish a pattern of institutionalized cooperation over the course of the transition. That could then facilitate the emergence of new political institutions. Instead, it initiates kind of a process of back and forth maximalist struggle over control of the transition. That, of course, culminates in 2013 with a massive movement demanding the resignation of transitional President Mohamed Morsi, which is followed by a military coup led by Defense Minister Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, and the massacre of Muslim Brotherhood protesters that I showed the image of at the beginning. And ultimately, again, sort of a return to a brutal authoritarian rule. Now, I contrast that in the special report with the recent case of the 2018 so-called Velvet Revolution in Armenia, where the mechanisms of success, I argue, is an election. So for those of you who aren't as familiar with this case, this is sort of a series of a nonviolent action campaign initiated by opposition political parties and civil society groups in Armenia in response to an attempted power grab by longtime Armenian president and later prime minister Serge Sargsyan, led by sort of opposition leader Nikol Pashinyan, who you can see pictured here. Now, as the movement grew, Pashinyan was demanding that Sargsyan step down and that Pashinyan be elected as the new prime minister of Armenia. And indeed, again, not going into too much detail here, ultimately that pressure was successful. The Parliament of Armenia, even though still dominated by Sargsyan's political party, elected Pashinyan as the new prime minister. And what this did, again, obviously, it puts an opposition actor who was also the leader of a civil resistance campaign in the key position of power and influence, well placed to shape both the transitional government and the any changes in political institutions that were going to happen as a result of the revolution, but also establishes that this happens through an institutionalized mechanism, a more cooperative mechanism, even if faced with done under a certain amount of pressure. And so this then sets up that political competition in the transition period is going to be through these more institutional avenues. Of course, and the result is that Armenia has seen really significant democratization over the last couple of years. This was placed under significant strain last year in the military conflict with Azerbaijan over the Nagorno-Karabakh region. And negative political reactions in Armenia to the particular peace settlement to that conflict. But Pashinyan's government was able to successfully weather that challenge and through a negotiated process, resolve a crisis challenge to their rule through the promise of new elections, which is really again, kind of the heart of democratic competition. Now, of course, things are still in process in this case, and so we don't know what the ultimate outcome is. But so far, the government has been able to weather challenges and put Armenia on a more democratizing path. So that's the underlying research that I have in the special report. And then I also mentioned what are some of the main takeaways for activists, external supporters for nonviolent action campaigns, and others that this research can indicate. Well, the first thing that I argue is that it is critical to increase local capacity for a democratizing breakthrough. Not all civil resistance campaigns have the same capacity to compete in an election or to engage in a dialogue or negotiation process with their political opponents. And so it's crucial to increase that capacity where it doesn't exist. And in the second shameless plug of my presentation, I'm going to mention that the Nonviolent Action Program at the U.S. Institute of Peace, where I work, has developed several resources in this space, particularly our Synergizing Nonviolent Action and Peace Building, or SNAP Action Guide, which brings together training on nonviolent action with training in key peace building skills like dialogue, negotiation, facilitation, and mediation, which can help civil resistance campaigns to better achieve breakthrough through something like through a mechanism like negotiations. As I mentioned, this guide's available for free on the USIP website in English, Spanish, and Arabic. And the U.S. Institute of Peace also conducts in-depth workshops to build these skills with movements around the world. So reach out if that is something that would be useful for you or your movement. Next, use the breakthrough mechanism itself to put democratizers, people with democratizing preferences, in positions of power and influence. As I mentioned before, the breakthrough moments are often when civil resistance campaigns have the most leverage over what a transition is going to look like. That power is likely to decrease over the course of the transition unless it is institutionalized in the particular setup of the political transition. Now, Armenia that I talked about before is a good example of this, but I think an earlier Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia is another particularly good example of this, where Václav Havel, who's pictured in the center here, who's a dissident, a leader of the civil resistance campaign, used the negotiation process with Czechoslovakia's communist government to get himself elected as president of Czechoslovakia, from which position he was able to sort of successfully shape that transition in a democratizing direction. Third, normalize new institutions for political competition. Now, as I talked about before, one of those key characteristics of breakthrough mechanisms is whether they set up new institutions that are going to move political competition from the sort of all or nothing revolutionary struggle that's characterized the pre-transition period into normal back and forth political competition. And I think sort of one particular good example of a sort of transitional setup that did this is the national dialogue in Tunisia following that country's 2011 revolution. Again, in which sort of a group of civil society actors was able to bring together the main political forces in the country to sort of negotiate some of their differences and set up a constitutional arrangement that was going to be acceptable to all of the main actors. And finally, paraphrasing a saying from classical Greece, beware generals bearing gifts. Coups, as I mentioned, are one of the most common breakthrough mechanisms that don't have these positive characteristics that elections and negotiations do, and indeed are typically associated with the most frequent sort of returns to authoritarianism and least frequent successful democratic transitions. Now, interacting with the military and security forces, and indeed working out ways of discouraging repression and even encouraging defections are key aspects of civil resistance campaigns. But civil resistance campaign leaders need to be careful that the initiative is still staying in their hands and that they are not ceding that initiative to military leaders who may not share their long-term democratic preferences. So with that, I will wrap up my presentation. I'll just say thank you once again to ICNC and to Maciej for supporting this work for so long. Thank you to all of you again for being here, and I'm very much looking forward to our questions and discussion.
Thank you, Jonathan. What a terrific, insightful presentation with a lot of interesting ideas and food for thought. So right now, we will open the floor for Q&A, and just to remind our listeners, they can raise their hands, and we will see your hand being raised on our end, and then we'll call upon you. We will unmute you. I will ask you to introduce yourself. You can say your also affiliation, and then ask your question. You can also type questions in the Q&A. But I will, at this moment, would privilege those who want to ask question live. So please take a moment, think about your question. And meanwhile, I wanted Jonathan to follow up with my question about, you talked about those three types of processes: the initiative, balance of power, and new institutions as being kind of important for understanding how democratization is more likely to happen. And I wanted to ask you, and at this moment, I don't know whether we were exploring that as well when I was going back and forth with you, reading your earlier drafts. But where would the issue of goals, actors' goals, fit into? Because when I was thinking about Egypt and thinking about Muslim Brotherhood and different actors that were participating in revolution, some of those actors, they had genuine democratic goals behind the kind of participation in that revolution. Muslim Brotherhood that joined later, and mainly because they were pushed by youth members in the organization, they came on board with different ideas and different kind of goals that arguably were not very compliant with kind of democracy projects that other Egyptian revolutionaries had. I don't even talk about kind of Western democratic goals, but like April 6th movement and their goals about democracy based on gender equality, based on embrace of political pluralism. So where the issue of, I guess, actors that are participating in nonviolent change and their goals would fit into your kind of, analytical observation about those three mechanisms of initiative, balance of power, and new institutions. You can answer right now, or if you want, I can see if there might be other people ready to right now join in the conversation. It depends. It really depends on you.
Yeah, I mean, I can offer some thoughts about that, and then we can go to others' questions. So I think, this is a really crucial point, and I think one thing that I would emphasize, and I mentioned this in the special report, is that I'm making probabilistic arguments here rather than deterministic arguments, meaning that none of these breakthrough mechanisms are a 100% guarantee that definitively you will end up as a democracy if this breakthrough mechanism is how a civil resistance campaign succeeds. What I'm arguing is that it makes it more likely. And the same thing goes for your question of the particular goals that actors who participate in a civil resistance campaign or who are sort of members of an old regime might have, why they might assume power. So I argue that kind of elections or negotiations, they're more likely to put civil resistance campaign leaders or organizations in positions of power and influence to give them a certain amount of initiative, and that these actors are more likely to have democratic goals, democratic preferences relative to, say, the military or leaders of the prior regime. This isn't sort of a 100% thing, but that if we look kind of on average, this is a group of organizations and people who are more likely to prefer democracy than the alternatives. But it's certainly not everyone. And I think in the case that you describe, anti-democratic preferences by an actor who maybe only partially assumed or claimed the mantle of democracy for the sake of participating in a civil resistance campaign would be kind of one factor that would undermine the sort of effective implementation of this of these mechanisms.
Thank you, Jonathan. I see a couple of hands raised. First, it's Kurt. Kurt, I will unmute you right now, and please introduce yourself and ask your question. You need to also unmute yourself on your end. You are self-muted.
Okay. Now, thank you very much. Hi, I'm Kurt Bessiner of Democratization Policy Council and also the University of St. Andrews here in Scotland. Thank you really a great deal for your presentation. I really enjoyed it, and I look forward to reading your written work more than I already have, including the new book. I was curious, and it's probably a subset of what you just presented on, but I'm wondering about the balance of power between this uneasy amalgam of civil resistance actors and political actors in trying to achieve a breakthrough. I ask specifically because we saw this in both Serbia and North Macedonia more recently. And in each case, there's a gravitational pull, especially from the external support element of established democracies, to gravitate toward institutionalism immediately. And there's a logic to that, but there's a downside to that too, is to declare victory and everything's done and great, now we have a government we can work with, la-di-da. And in both cases, I think, though it's probably not as observed in Macedonia's case as in Serbia's case, because it's not as far along, those democracies have been hollowed out. In North Macedonia's case, it's just an adoption by the Zaev government of essentially the system that Gruevski had, albeit less ugly, with camouflage by their external positive dealing with the name dispute of Greece. So I'm just curious whether that balance of power or disposition, which is common, affects the likelihood of a democratic breakthrough, rather a successful democratic transition. Whether that balance is a factor or is something, whether you studied that specifically at all or not.
Thank you, Kurt. Jonathan, again, I can collect more questions, or you can go ahead and respond to Kurt.
I'm happy to go ahead and respond to that. Yeah, so thank you, Kurt. That's a great question, and I appreciate sort of your kind words about my research. I will say that's not something that I have looked at specifically in this special report. It is something that I think is a really key challenge, and I've done some separate research on that related to my work on the Anatomy of Resistance Campaigns project at the Norwegian University of Science and Technology prior to coming to USIP, where I am now, where we collected data on the participating organizations in civil resistance campaigns, looking particularly at things like the participation of political parties, labor unions, religious groups, that sort of thing. And one of the key things that we found was that basically campaigns that are dominated by political parties tend to lead to sort of lower levels of democracy than campaigns that have more significant participation by we call them quotidian civil society organizations, basically sort of groups like labor unions or religious groups that are sort of more embedded in people's day-to-day lives and don't themselves kind of compete for political power, in part because we argued that they are more likely to have kind of sustained democratic preferences rather than sort of the kind of preference for democracy when you're out of power, but perhaps not so much preference for democracy once you're in power, as may be the case with some more more explicitly political actors. So there is kind of that dynamic, I think, within civil resistance campaigns. I think this varies a lot depending on the particular circumstances of the country in which the campaign is taking place, and even like the particular people who are in leadership of, say, a political party. But it is a really key challenge, kind of navigating, once your campaign is over and you are trying to sort of, ultimately you do want to kind of set up new political institutional arrangements. What is the place for some people to go into government, for other people to remain sort of outside of government in civil society as an accountability mechanism? It's a really tough challenge to navigate, and I think that several some of the cases that you mentioned and others, it's one that has been really difficult in the subsequent years to the civil resistance campaign.
Thank you, Jonathan. Right now, I would like to go to Jacob. Jacob Lewis, I will unmute you and go ahead, introduce yourself and ask your question.
Wonderful, great. Can you hear me, Jonathan? Yes. Great, okay. My name is Jacob Lewis. I'm an assistant professor of global politics at Washington State University. Jonathan, thanks for a great research presentation. I always love hearing about your work. I wanted to ask a question about the relationship between civil resistance movements and coups. On the surface, these seem to be things that are opposed to one another, right? Mass civil resistance is often quite, pro-democracy, and coups are themselves quite anti-democratic. So what did you find about the sort of tipping point linkage between these? you know, because there's this whole coordination game that has to be played by those who engage in a coup. And so I'm kind of working on something similar to this. So I'd love to know, did you see any sort of specific tipping point that seemed to lead toward coups or not?
Thanks, Jacob. That's a great question, and I appreciate, Jacob. I will say you not asking me something incredibly difficult. Jacob is a friend of mine, and we spoke a couple days ago, and he promised that he said he was going to join this webinar and ask me a question that I couldn't possibly answer. So I'm grateful that this is a good question, but an answerable one. So I think. Exactly. I think you put your finger on something which is really key here, which is, you know, civil resistance and military coups seem to be very opposed to each other, but they also, you know, they also in a not insignificant number of cases co-occur. And so why is this the case? I'll say sort of that particular question isn't something that I focused on in this particular research project, and it isn't something that I've done kind of in-depth work on of my own. But there are sort of a few people out there who have been doing work on this question, and so I will basically be sort of copying what I know from others in the literature. And I think sort of one thing that's been pointed to a few different times by a few different people is that, you know, kind of mass, you know, nonviolent action or even sort of mass like civil resistance campaigns, or even just kind of mass protest more generally, can be one powerful way to help resolve that coordination problem that you're describing. You know, a situation in which the military, for whatever reason, may have been, you know, unhappy with the regime in power for quite some time, but you know, they aren't able to solve that key coordination problem in order to actually stage a coup, and they don't have kind of the forms of external legitimacy that would facilitate that process. But the situation, you know, a situation of mass protest or an organized civil resistance campaign can provide an opportunity in which military leaders are able to sort of take up the mantle of the people more easily. It facilitates that, and that can be one sort of, you know, one key way of solving that coordination problem. That, you know, it makes clear that sort of support for the opponent is for the regime in power is not widespread, that there is widespread opposition, in fact, to it, and so, you know, it can kind of open the door for those conversations between different factions of the military that can then sort of spark a military coup. Yeah, I'm afraid I don't have a more sort of specific trigger point to tell you, but I think that's kind of one key, like, a few key reasons why we do see this kind of co-occurrence of, you know, mass protest and civil resistance campaigns with military coups or other kinds of coups d'etat.
Good. Let's go right now to Scott. Scott, I will unmute you. You are self-muted as well on your end, so you can unmute yourself and introduce yourself and please ask your question.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Jonathan. You and I are sort of co-alumni of the University of Denver, although I'm a little bit before you. I work with civil society in movements and environmental and human rights work around the world, but these days mostly in Mexico and Southeast Asia. I'm interested specifically in the concept of in making important this key moment, or making it one moment, right? And I really liked the way you said, well, this one moment, what's important is what comes afterwards, and how does society continue to build institutions. I'm thinking specifically of South Africa, where I was a reporter at the time that Mandela was let out of prison, and in my perspective, there was a lot of hype around that and the elections themselves, but really it was the peace and reconciliation process that went on for 2 years after the election that if I were to label a breakthrough, I'd say the election wasn't. That was the breakthrough. That's what really forced South Africans to focus on building institutions of democracy. And I know that kind of counters it, but I'm just wondering if you struggled with this concept of peace and reconciliation processes and whether or not they actually were breakthrough moments where in a more grassrootsy way, instead of coups and elections and big movement leaders taking over, in a more grassrootsy way, really the culture of democracy was built.
Thanks, Scott. Great to have another University of Denver alum joining. We're everywhere. Yeah. So, and I have to thank you for this question as well, because I mean it's a really wonderful question, and it also gives me the opportunity to talk about some other work that I'm doing, and actually an upcoming event next week put on by the U.S. Institute of Peace on Tuesday, April 20th. We're going to be talking about some new research that I've done with Dr. Veronique Dudoué from the Berkhoff Foundation that is actually focusing, I mean, almost exactly on the question that you raised of the impact of these kinds of dialogue processes, negotiation processes, mediation, that sort of thing in the context of political transitions after civil resistance campaigns. You know, in this particular piece that I've talked about today, I'm really focusing on this one particular moment and how that one particular moment then has longer term impacts. But it is certainly true, as you described, that that moment is not like, it's not sort of like, you hit the billiard ball and then sort of everything just kind of clacks into place afterwards. Like, no, these processes of contestation continue afterwards. And continue to shape sort of the ultimate outcome of a political transition. And in my sort of my prior work, I've looked at the impact of kind of continued mobilization and the shift away from maximalism during political transitions. And then in this upcoming work, focus specifically on this question of dialogue and negotiation processes. Go into more detail on that. You can join our event next week. But I'll just say briefly here, one of the key things that we focused on there was the aspect of inclusion, that when these sorts of processes are kind of sort of maximally inclusive, and not just by sort of ticking the box of we have particular groups here, but also that sort of the selection mechanisms, decision-making mechanisms, that sort of thing, make that inclusion actually meaningful. That's when these processes tend to sort of facilitate real democratic progress. But happy to share more about that. Either you can reach out to me individually, or we have this event at USIP coming up next week.
Okay, great. Now I see another hand here. Michael Beer, I will unmute you, and please go ahead and ask your question.
Thank you, Jonathan, for this terrific work. Just admire you greatly. I have 3 questions. I don't know if you can get to them all. One is the role of business, chambers of commerce kind of institutions in these transitions. Do you see any particular impact or role for them in certain cases and certain times? What about the role of referenda as opposed to elections? Is that a kind of a breakthrough kind of dynamic that we see or not? And then finally, what role has anybody looked at the role of the ruling political party and what happens to them in a subsequent transition, and whether that kind of plays a role or an indicator in terms of outcomes?
Thanks, Michael. I think I should probably be able to get to all three of those. I'll do it quickly. And I say the admiration is mutual as well. So thank you for your kind words. That means a lot to me. On sort of the role of business and chambers of commerce, I will just have to say I don't know. I mean, I think it's something that I have come across, reading about a few particular cases, but it's not something that I have any kind of systematic insights on. As I recall from the Anatomy of Resistance Campaigns data project, I don't think we had sort of business as a category in its own right, though I could be wrong about that. And my co-author, my sort of co-authors on that project will I'm sure correct me if that's not correct. But yeah, I mean, I think it's very potentially interesting. I think of cases like, the Iranian Revolution in the 1970s. A lot of people have talked about the impact of the Bazaris, who are sort of a businessman economic class, but I don't know sort of systematically. Referenda, I have to apologize. I think this is a point of lack of clarity on my part. So for the sake of simplicity, I kind of group everything that is sort of an electoral mechanism of some kind into the category of elections. So that would both be sort of elections in a representative democracy sense of like electing a president or a new parliament, that sort of thing, but also would include things like referendum, like say in Chile in the 1980s. That I would include that in that category. With the insight, with the sort of the underlying intuition that these are things that are happening through kind of the general framework of an electoral process. On ruling political parties, again, it's a really crucial question. It's not something that I have looked at personally, but I know there are sort of several scholars who have examined this question of what are the sort of the long-term fates of former authoritarian political parties. And I have to apologize, my mind is blanking on sort of names right off the top of my head. But if you reach out to me via email, I'm sure I will be able to think of it, and I can send you some names or some citations. My recollection of my familiarity with that literature is that in general, that post-transition democracies tend to do better when sort of former ruling parties are able to survive and sort of enter political competition as kind of normal political parties. In part, sort of with the insight of that literature being that when old regime elites see that democracy can hold some kind of future for them, then they are their preferences are more likely to sort of shift in a democratic direction, and they are sort of less likely to try and undermine the transition and have kind of a full-fledged return to authoritarianism. So I think a key aspect of sort of blending that work with my work is looking at this question of balance, where how can you sort of make sure that people with more democratic preferences are in positions of influence and power, and have that sort of greater initiative for shaping a transition, but that even those who may have more anti-democratic preferences aren't so motivated or so excluded from the political system that sort of their incentives are just like fully and completely to try and undermine it and stage a counter-revolution of some kind. So I think that balance is something that's really key.
Thank you, Jonathan. We are coming to the end of our webinar, but I was just looking through the questions that were written down, and I've got a straightforward question from Grace that I wanted to read for you, which is how the negotiations that you talked about that are so important in democratization can take place when the movement itself is leaderless. Perhaps you could address that, Jonathan, quickly.
Yes. Maciej, I thought you said this was a simple question. No, I mean, I think it's it's another very important question. And I think this is a key challenge that a lot of movements face. and that I think Egypt is one good example of this. I keep coming back to it because it fits a lot of these challenges that there were sort of attempted negotiations at particular phases, but the figures that the regime wanted to negotiate with were not kind of considered legitimate by the protesters on the streets, and it was more difficult to identify sort of legitimate leaders whose voices could be respected. I will say I don't have a magic formula for how this works. I just think it's a real challenge that movements need to keep in mind. Movements, of course, often adopt leaderless structures. There are practical reasons about resisting repression that can make leaderless movements more attractive. There are in some cases ideological reasons, like some movements may have just sort of a sort of fear of co-optation or opposition to hierarchy. But I think developing mechanisms through which people can legitimately speak for the movement are really key. That's going to look different depending on what your movement is, who the constituencies in the movement are, and how they most appreciate having their voices heard. But I think it's important to start the negotiation process within the movement, so that you have that sort of consensus building process before you are then kind of speaking to the opponent. Because if you have it, especially in kind of a more leaderless, diffuse movement, if you haven't sort of worked those things out on an internal basis, then it seems sort of highly unlikely that anyone will be able to sort of legitimately speak for the movement in any kind of external negotiations. So yeah, no one-size-fits-all solution there, but I think building those negotiation skills and starting within the movement before you try and build out to the opponent are a couple of key principles there.
Thank you, Jonathan. I stand corrected. The construction of the sentence was simple, but you responded great to that question, which is indeed a difficult one. This brings to the conclusion our webinar. Excellent presentation, excellent Q&A. I just will remind the audience that we have recorded that webinar, and we will be posting that webinar on ICNC website. We will be also sending the recording or the link to the recorded webinar to those who registered for that. And if we have any remaining questions that were written down and sent to us, Jonathan, we will send that to you to give you a chance basically to respond in writing, and we'll also post your responses to the web page on the web page of the webinar. And so thank you everyone for joining us. We've got also a number of forthcoming ICNC webinars, and we will be sending information about them to those who registered for our mailing list and those who registered for our webinar. Here is only the sample of those forthcoming webinars, and we will look forward to having you join us as well. So once again, I would like to thank a lot our key speaker today, and remind everyone that you can access Jonathan's special report on the ICNC website for free. So please use that opportunity, download it and read in your free time. And we look forward to seeing you the other time. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Maciej.
Thank you.